When we got home, Mara, our maid, came out of the porch to greet us, worry creasing her face. She wiped her hands on her apron and glanced over her shoulder. "Shanu's here." I clapped a hand over my mouth as my stomach flipped. I'd completely forgotten I was supposed to be having dinner with Shanu and her family today. Uncle gave a wry grin as Mara stood aside to let me enter the house. "Good luck," he said. Shanu was waiting in the visiting room. Uncle used to tell me that was how we knew we were well-to-do, that we had a room specifically for receiving guests, not used for anything else. Except that now it was being used to store all the stuff we'd salvaged from Diareg's house. All the stuff we hadn't thrown out immediately, anyway. Shanu sat on the edge of the couch, prim and upright, partly because she was a young lady, and that's how young ladies sat, but mostly because the rest of the couch was occupied by a stack of dented saucepans, a parasol stand, and a stuffed bear's head. She gave me a smile that could have drawn blood. "Raltarn, how delightful to see you. I'm so glad you found room for me in your busy social calendar." I held up my hands. "Shanu, I'm sorry, I got caught up in something," and she cut me off with, "Rather like I found room for myself in here amid all the clutter." She stood and hitched up her skirt. I averted my eyes from her ankles and put the mirror where she'd been sitting. She went to the door, picking her way like a sandpiper over and among the obstacles Uncle had strewn in her path. Hand on the doorknob, she turned and asked, "What are you waiting for?" "I'm sorry, I thought, well, don't think. Not as much, anyway." She held out her other hand. I took it. That I didn't have to think about. My stomach flipped again, but in a good way this time. In the hall we manoeuvred around Uncle and Mara. Shanu and Uncle exchanged pleasant greetings. Outside, Shanu said with a little sigh, "You have a lot to recommend you, sweetness. I just wish I didn't have to run after you all the time." "I said I was sorry," I said. "Well, don't. A gentleman never apologizes, because he never does anything he has to apologize for." My old schoolmaster's words echoed in my head. I guess that meant I wasn't a gentleman. I looked around for a taxi, not seeing one. Shanu tugged gently on my hand, leading me along the footpath. "Do you want to walk?" I said. "Don't sound so surprised. It's only 10 minutes. Quicker than waiting for a taxi at this time of day." Walking between our houses was quicker than a taxi at just about any time of day, but that wasn't the point. "How late am I?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. "About a quarter of an hour." That wasn't as bad as I feared, but still half an hour later than I would have liked to be. At the junction of Cooper Street and Vintner Street, we had to wait while a column of soldiers marched across our route. They looked to be raw recruits, some of them younger than me. Many hadn't quite got the hang of keeping step with their comrades and kept bumping into the man behind or in front of them. One soldier, older and with a more certain pace than most, grinned and waved at Shanu. "I'll kill a dragon for you, miss." I gripped her hand tighter and forced myself not to scowl. How dare he be so familiar with a lady? She returned a little smile and wave. "I very much doubt that," she murmured when the column had passed. "They'll be doing well if they manage to kill one between them," I said. She nodded sadly. "My cousin sold his horse to the army the other day." "I thought it was on its last legs," I said. "She, not it. They didn't seem to care, and they gave him a third more than the knackers were offering. No wonder you have to wait so long for a taxi these days." As we turned the corner of the street where Shanu lived, I slipped my hand out of hers. It wouldn't do to be so affectionate where her parents might see us. Their house was at the end of the street, a quiet cul-de-sac. It stood on about 1/8 of an acre, most of which was at the front, the better to impress the neighbours. The house was larger than ours. Uncle could probably have told you by how many square feet. When he'd first met her parents, he'd offered to redecorate their visitors' room, which had gone down about as well as a dancing troupe at a Missourian vigil. In spite of that, they'd agreed to our engagement, though they didn't invite Uncle to dine with them any more than protocol deemed necessary. "Relax," whispered Shanu as she pushed open the gate. I noticed my fists had clenched, and swallowed to moisten my throat. This never got any easier. We walked up the path. They still had their shrubs and flower beds. Most of the people of Cymera had switched to growing vegetables, but Shanu's parents were rich enough not to need to bother. I sometimes wondered if they'd noticed there was a war going on. Shanu put her hand on the lock of the front door and whispered the spell to open it. A tingly warmth passed over me, almost like when we were holding hands. I loved seeing her do magic. Inside the porch I cast a light spell while she locked the door. That was one concession to the war. Since tallow had become more expensive, her family had stopped leaving lanterns burning in unoccupied rooms. I moved the light over my head to let her lead the way to the dining room at the back of the house. I held my breath as she opened its door. Her parents sat at the far side of the dining table, silhouetted by the late afternoon sun that streamed in over the river and the west side of the city. Every time I ate dinner here, I wondered why they chose to turn their backs on this view. 1,000 years of history spread before them. "Sir, lady," I said, "I must apologise for our lateness. It was my fault." Shanu's father cut me off with a shake of his head. He wasn't interested in excuses. With a barely perceptible wave of his hand, he indicated that we should sit. He nodded to the butler, who pulled a rope hanging in the corner. Somewhere in the depths of the house, a bell rang. Sweat trickled down my back as we waited. The door opened, and the butler, I'd never learned his name in all the time I'd been calling here, accepted a tray of soup from the cook and distributed it to us. We didn't speak during the meal. That, I'd learned early on, was another distinction between rich people and the rest of us. They could afford to concentrate on doing one thing at a time. The dessert was something cold and crunchy that tasted faintly of lemons. I would have preferred to skip it, as it made my teeth hurt, but that would have been even ruder than arriving late. Finally, the butler brought in a bottle of sweet wine and poured us all a glass. He placed the bottle at Father's elbow, then lit a candle in the middle of the table and left the room. We sipped at our wine, and then Father said, "So, young sir, it's nearly a year since you first proposed marriage to our daughter." My head swam as if I'd downed the entire glass. "Yes, sir, a fortnight tomorrow. I was thinking perhaps a little celebration, with your permission, of course. Perhaps a boating trip on the lake." Before Shanu, the longest engagement in our family was 10 months. "Oh." I tried not to bite my lip. "We were curious to know how much longer you intend to keep our daughter waiting." I glanced at Shanu, who appeared to be clenching her teeth. I realise, sir, it is inappropriate to test a lady's patience, but I wish to ensure that I can provide Shanu with the type of living to which she is accustomed." Father leaned back and drank some more of his wine. "Very wise, young sir. But surely you recall that you said almost exactly the same words to me when you first requested my leave to promise yourself to her." I sipped at my own wine, willing my hand not to tremble as I put the glass back down. "I did, sir. And what progress have you made towards that end in the 11.5 months since?" "I've accumulated about 400 svara from investments and working in my uncle's business." Mother tittered. "Do you think you'll be living in a stable in Dartmouth?" Father gave her a brief scowl. "I would have hoped to hear 2 or 3 times that sum." "I cannot help but wonder whether your intentions towards our daughter are entirely serious. That is to say, whether you've been wasting our time." He lifted his glass. I gulped. "Quite serious, sir. I love Shanu with all my heart. I would—" He set his glass down with a loud clink. "Love, young sir, is a luxury you cannot afford. I want you to double your fortune in the next 3 months, or we will cancel the engagement." I felt as though I was falling and grabbed the edge of the table. I let go before I pulled the cloth off. "Father, please," said Shanu. "You've had more than enough time already, young sir. I'm only giving you fair warning." "He's a good man, Father," said Shanu. "I don't mind living somewhere smaller and more remote." She glanced at me as though hopeful she wouldn't have to make good on the promise. 3 months, said Father. "No more." He stood, signalling that the conversation was over, and left the room, Mother following him. The butler spent a minute or two clearing the table. I handed my glass to him, still half full of wine. That was rude, but I had no stomach for the stuff now. Once the butler had gone, Shanu moved her chair closer and laid her hand on mine. My breath caught in my throat at the thought someone might come in and see us. "I'm sorry, sweetness," she whispered. Her eyes glistened. "Did you know?" With the tiniest shake of her head, she replied, "He told me this morning. It was horrible of him to put you down like that in front of Mother and me. I'll try to persuade him to give you more time," I cut her off with. "Do you think I won't manage it?" and immediately wished I hadn't. Shanu withdrew her hand and looked down, blinking. If it was my decision alone, if it was just a matter of love. But it wasn't, and it wasn't. We talked of inconsequential things after that. Soon it was time for me to leave, to be sure of reaching home before curfew. We stood, sharing a brief, delicate embrace, and kissed one another on the cheeks. "Sometimes I wish we didn't have to be quite so well-mannered," she whispered as she let go of me. "You look as though you need a bigger hug than it would be polite to give you." My eyes stung. "I'll be fine," I said, though I could have done with a hug like that. I bade her farewell and left the building. Thanks for listening to that extract from my novel, The Mirrors of Elangir. If you'd like to read more or find out where to buy a copy, please visit my website at www.pembers.net. Thank you.